From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated across the country on the Biz Talk Radio Network and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio WYBC and 1490 AM WGCH Greenwich. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. A leading psychological biographer breaches the Goldwater rule to infer Trump mentally unfit for the presidency, while a leading Watergate figure from the Nixon administration predicts the Trump presidency will end in a calamity. The first of two shows we're going to do on the Trump presidency, the other for balance. We will have a leading conservative pundit on the Trump agenda. All of this today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. John Gartner served as part-time assistant professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University Medical School for 28 years. His areas of specializations include borderline personality disorder, bipolar disorder, and depression. He's the author of In Search of Bill Clinton, a psychological biography for which he was on this show. Also the author of The Hypomanic Edge, the link between a little craziness and a lot of success in America. John Dean, legal counsel to President Nixon during the Watergate scandal, his Senate testimony helping lead to Nixon's resignation ultimately. The New York Times bestselling author of Blind Ambition and Broken Government, Conservatives Without a Conscience, along with Worse Than Watergate, and he was on this show for his latest book, The Nixon Defense, What He Knew and When He Knew It. Welcome, both Johns. We'll look at first his fitness, and we'll look at the performance issues so far on Mr. Trump. And let me start with a quote. Donald Trump is dangerously mentally ill and temperamentally incapable of being president. Trump has malignant narcissism, which is incurable, and that's John Gartner. What is malignant narcissism, and what do you mean?
Yes, well, malignant narcissism was actually a term that was introduced by Erich Fromm, a famous psychoanalyst who escaped Hitler's Germany. And it was actually his attempt to psychologically explain Hitler. So we could even call it the Hitler personality disorder because it was actually retrofitted to explain Hitler. It involves four. Yeah, exactly. So I know as a Jewish person, you're never supposed to use the H word, but I'm using it because it fits. And it has four components. One is the one that everyone, I think, at this point is aware of, which is narcissism. That alone would not be so disqualifying. The problem is it combines three other features. Paranoid personality disorder, all of his conspiracy theories, and his tendency to see other people as so malevolent, who, like the press, for example, who he thinks are scum, and minorities and immigrants who he demonizes. And antisocial personality disorder, which is essentially the criminal personality disorder. So someone who routinely violates the rights of others, who lies, who exploits others, and feels no shame or remorse about it. And finally, a fourth component, sadism, in other words, being a bully. If you put these four components together, this is the temperament or the personality of a Hitler. But believe it or not, that's not even the worst news. He's a malignant narcissist on a good day. On a bad day, he's delusional. On a bad day, he's psychotic. He has delusions of grandeur and delusions of persecution. So we have had presidents with bad characters before, though not many. I'm very interested to hear what John Dean has to say about comparing him to Nixon. But I don't believe we've ever had a president who was actually thought disordered or psychotic before.
We're about to ask John about that linkage, but just before we do that, explain quickly the Goldwater rule, and are you breaking some kind of a big ethical code here?
I think I'm breaking a small ethical code to support a bigger ethical issue. That I think the duty to warn the public, and that is one of our duties, if we have a patient we think might potentially harm somebody, confidentiality is one of our highest ethical principles, but we're actually bound to violate confidentiality, to warn someone who might be harmed by that person. Well, that's what we're supposed to do in terms of our most sacred principle, confidentiality, to warn one person. Here, I'm saying that people with psychological training and expertise have a unique window into the way in which Donald Trump is dangerous to the public. And so we believe, we've actually formed an organization of therapists called Duty to Warn, that we do have a higher ethical duty to warn the public about imminent danger that's far more pressing and central.
Okay, if anybody knows what it's like to work with a allegedly paranoid leader, in fact, a president, it would be John Dean. Do you see comparisons between Nixon and Trump and differences?
Well, I have no qualification whatsoever to do any kind of psychological analysis of Nixon. I have read a number that were done, most of them post-Watergate, And the most striking feature of Nixon to me, where I've actually done some study, is when I did the book Conservatives Without Conscience, and I was trying to understand what had happened to the Republican Party, and I actually started that project with the late Senator Goldwater. We disbanded the project. He was very upset with the religious right and what they were doing to the conservative movement. And when we abandoned the project, it was because his health got bad and never got better, and then I put the book on the shelf and did it years later. But the title came from his book, The Conscience of a Conservative. Anyway, what the body of science that I got way down in the weeds and then got some help from somebody to get me up to 30,000 feet to look at what I'd seen down in the weeds, is the work that was done on authoritarian personalities. Started post-World War II, and now we have about 70 years of it. What I discovered is that Nixon was on almost any scale pretty high as an authoritarian personality, as well as those who were his followers. And that's the way the authoritarian personality breaks down. You have most of them are followers, people who want to have a strong leader and want to be told how to think and what to do. Others they're called right-wing authoritarians, the testing scale that psychology uses. And then on the other side, the leaders are called social dominators. Nixon was clearly a social dominator. These are people who would jump out in front and say, "Follow me, I can solve all these problems." And they have rather unattractive, both these groups have unattractive personality traits, some of which sound very much like what John Gartner just outlined, which is in a greater degree than I found in the work I did. Anyway, there's no question that Nixon was an authoritarian. We know that not because of his public behavior as much as we know what happened behind closed doors from his secret taping system. I see real similarities between Nixon, the private Nixon, and Trump. The public Nixon was shy, highly rehearsed, and really on stage. I suspect that the public Trump is pretty much the way he is in private, from what I'm told as well.
That's definitely true. In fact, we'll talk about that a little bit later. Aside from clinical diagnoses, John Dean, being face-to-face behind the scenes with Nixon, did you get a sense of paranoia and just things that almost seem mentally unbalanced?
Not really. Nixon was very bright. He very opinionated, had strong feelings about things. He understood the world better than his own family, and he was obviously a complex man. I don't have dealings with him outside of group-level meetings where I'm in there with his top inner aides. The White House counsel, which was the job I had, was and is a middle-level staff job. You tend to report to the president through others. And so it's not till the end. I have about 37 meetings with him, which were pretty deadly for him because I remembered the meetings, and I would later testify.
John Gartner now, two things. One, is mental illness, should it be disqualifying because LBJ, Nixon, et cetera? The second part of that is, right. In your Clinton book, he's a narcissist, hypomanic you use, but you're very positive on Clinton's aspect of it versus Trump's narcissism.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point. I'm certainly not saying that anybody with any form of mental illness is disqualified from being president. You mentioned a couple of examples, and we could think of others. But if we were to create a Frankenstein monster and try to put together the most toxic, destructive psychiatric symptoms in the DSM, we could not improve on Donald Trump. This is truly, and I really do hate to say this, a worst-case scenario, that we have a madman in the White House, that the person who is in control is out of control. And it's very interesting to me to hear Mr. Dean talk because he's been one of my heroes since I was a kid. I remember watching the Watergate hearings, being riveted to them and watching almost every minute of them. But I have to say that I would almost welcome a President Nixon right now compared to Trump. And I never, ever thought I could ever say those words.
Well, I must say the same,
Mr.
actually,
Dean put it,
having been there. And Trump, I find very scary.
Yeah, and I think that the reason John Dean put his finger on it, I think that Nixon, even though he did have some paranoid and some antisocial traits, was not irrational in the sense that he was divorced from reality. He didn't think in a delusional way. He wasn't psychotic. This is a huge difference. We're talking about someone who cannot distinguish between his fantasies and reality.
Business Talk with Jim Campbell over the Business Talk Radio Network, over 350 stations around the country. Go to biztalkradio.com, find the station closest to you, listen over the Internet, access our podcast. We'll move now from on the couch to in the Oval Office. We'll look at the performance thus far right next. We're back with Watergate figure John Dean and psychological biographer John Gartner. And we're going to start off with John Dean, because if anybody would be good on this, it would be John. You said the Trump presidency will end in a calamity. What exactly do you mean?
Well, it's hard to believe that the way it's begun, that it's going to have a good ending. While the most striking thing to me so far is his ignorance. I don't think the man has a good newspaper knowledge of how the presidency or Washington work. I suspect he has never read a biography or autobiography of any of his predecessors. And he's been very slow in really getting staff around him that knows what's going on. To the contrary, and they're doing this in the departments and agencies as well, they're firing people who actually know how the place runs. And it's something of the blind leading the blind at this point. So this can only result in trouble. Fortunately, in the first 50-some days he's been in the office, we've not had a disaster. But when they come fast, and you really need the machine running. He calls his White House a fine-tuned machine, which again is delusional. That place is just a total chaos silo, if you will.
Let me ask John Dean, there's some quotes of yours that I've taken. Maybe you can put some color behind them on this. One is, I don't think Richard Nixon even comes close to the level of corruption we already know about Trump. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, when I first saw Trump surface as a viable candidate, I happened to be back in New Jersey doing a program for lawyers, and a senior partner who was then in his 90s and still practicing told me at lunch, he said, I've had about 20 lawsuits with Donald Trump. He said he's the most dishonest man I've ever met. At that time, it hadn't come out that his practice in business was to screw his subcontractors, and force them into court to collect their due when he completed a job, and that's what he was referring to. That he represented a number of people who had been stiffed by Trump, and we now know that was a standard operating procedure. So that's a pretty corrupt way to do your business. And we also now know the just phenomenal degree of dishonesty. He cannot seem to tell an honest report of anything about himself, his life, or anything that connects or touches on him.
Do you have a sense what will be that calamity?
No, I don't. That's tea leaf reading I can't do, but I just know he's unprepared to handle it. He hasn't surrounded himself with people. Mike Pence has some government experience, but he's been on Capitol Hill, which is a big difference from being in the executive branch.
John Gartner, John Dean just mentioned this, by the way. What does it mean when you're a pathological liar, first off?
Yeah, I think what's amazing about Donald Trump, and I agree, his level of dishonesty is off the charts, as well as his level of ignorance. But as Lance Dotis said, a psychoanalyst who was with me on the Lawrence O'Donnell show, that Donald Trump really tells two kinds of lies. The first, which he tells often, are lies of the normal sort meant to deceive other people. That's the antisocial side of him. But the other set of lies he tells that are actually much more dangerous are lies he tells to himself, where he convinces himself of delusional ideas that are grandiose or persecutory. So whether it's that he had the largest crowd size in American history, which was a fits the definition of delusion because it was a demonstrably false belief. This is the definition, psychiatric definition of delusion, that he holds rigidly and is not open to any amount of contrary evidence or reasoning. That's the definition of a delusion. So he kept asserting over and over again this demonstrably false belief that he had the largest crowd size. Now he's asserting the demonstrably false belief that Barack Obama bugged his offices. This is a kind of lie he's telling himself as well as other people. And because he slides back and forth, it's always a little difficult to know, is he lying to us or is he lying to us and himself? It's not always clear, but he's capable of both kinds of lies. And that's why I'm certain that Mr. Dean is correct, that this is going to end in catastrophe. And as he says, we can't know exactly what the mechanism will be. Will it be in North Korea? Will it be an economic collapse? Will it be a scandal? But let me put it to you this way. I've put all my money in cash.
Well, at least you ought to tell us what you really think here, John Gartner. Let me ask you, John, while you're talking, the transition from reality star to politics, I mean, in reality, his exaggerations there, his sort of manipulation of the media, it was sort of in good fun as a private individual and as a reality star. The transition to politics, is that the problem that's driving his hatred of the media? I mean, because the media has made him. John Gardner.
This is someone who is paranoid and who suffered from delusions of persecution. And when people like this, they demonize the people who create opposition or even interference for them. They don't just see them as people who need to be negotiated with or people who need to be dealt with or people who need to be opposed. They actually see them as evil. This is the paranoid side, this projection of malevolence. So the things he said about the press, for example, it's not, lots of presidents have been angry at the press, but he has gone over the top in terms of seeing them as evil scum who are the enemies of the people. I mean, that's not only politically fascistic, it's crazy.
But John Dean, isn't that the way Nixon felt about the media? Press?
Well, he was angry at the media, but if you notice that one of the huge differences between Nixon and Trump on that is Nixon did it largely behind closed doors. He would call them the enemy to Kissinger and tell Kissinger, now go right down 3 times or infinitely, the press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. He would push his people in that regard. He had his enemies list. He had his efforts to shut off the Washington Post and the New York Times, wouldn't let them into some events, not unlike Trump. But and of course, leaking was the bane of his presidency, causing the ultimate downfall of it because he went way over the top in dealing with it, far beyond the law, obviously. So, I don't think that he was nuts about it, but he knew exactly what he was doing. He was just trying to quietly, behind the scenes, give them a very, very difficult time because he was unhappy with their coverage. And the interesting thing is, it worked a little bit. He had his Governor Chuck Colson on his staff, who policed the media. And when the president was unhappy with coverage, Chuck would get on the phone and call the head of CBS, NBC, ABC, whatever, and read them the riot act. And it worked. They would tame their coverage sometimes. So, I think he was a little paranoid in his overreaction, but not totally off the chart.
You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell. We'll go into a little bit more detail on whether a Watergate calamity is inevitable in the Trump administration. So stay with us. We're back with John Gartner, author of In Search of Bill Clinton, a psychological biography, and John Dean, author of The Nixon Defense, What He Knew and When He Knew It. I want to start with John Dean. And Watergate started as a third-rate burglary, as we all know. And I'm wondering if a Watergate-like calamity might be the whole Russian issue.
It's going to be worse than Watergate. The Russia issue kind of breaks down into three categories. Did Trump collude with the Russians to try to harm Hillary while helping himself through the leaking of emails? Then there's the period between the election day and the inauguration where there's some serious questions as to whether the Trump people were in collusion to try to undercut President Obama's sanctions on Russia for their interfering in the election. And then, of course, the third area they're investigating is the dossier that surfaced from the MI6 agent, Mr. Steele, that is pretty devastating. That shows that Trump has been compromised by the, not only he's compromised and colluded with the Russians. So those are the three areas, and any one of those, if they bear out, would appear to me to be the end of his presidency.
Would be bigger than Watergate, potentially.
Yes.
John Dean, let me ask you this. An interesting parallel is Nixon, was accused of trying to interfere in the 68 election by trying to get the Vietnam peace negotiations, put a little wiggle room in there so that they wouldn't settle before. And now we have this issue with, did Trump try to collude before the election? Do you see similarities there?
Absolutely. We not only have the accusation now, but a historian by the name of John Farrell has got a book coming out on the 21st of this month, March, and did an op-ed for the New York Times reporting that he had been able to find corroboration in H.R. Haldeman's campaign notes where Nixon is giving instructions to his staff to interfere with Lyndon Johnson's efforts to reach peace in Vietnam by keeping the South Vietnamese from coming to the table, telling them that they'll get a better deal under Nixon. Lyndon Johnson was aware of this and called it treason. It well could be under the law, and Nixon successfully covered that up throughout his presidency, and there's some reason to believe that this was behind a lot of his actions. For example, at one point he wanted a break-in at the Brookings Institute in Washington, and it's believed that he was concerned that they had some information that would nail him on his interference with Johnson's peace efforts.
One more thing for John Dean while we're on that. So Trump is sort of letting this filter around, as we're seeing. Is that the biggest mistake Nixon made? Was the cover-up was worse than the crime that he didn't try and deal with? Is that a similarity?
Well, as I said, the cover-up of his '68 activity was actually successful. They didn't that didn't get uncovered until 44 decades later. But there's no question that there's no evidence that Nixon had any knowledge they were going to break into Watergate. However, he was certainly aware that he had people set up over there with that kind of mentality and capability. He just didn't give the order on that one. Had they not been arrested at the Watergate, he had given an order that was their real mission that night, which was to go into George McGovern's headquarters. And he said, put a plant in. And I don't think he was talking about a flower. So the cover-up, it ended his presidency because what happened is Watergate went way beyond a bungled burglary that he'd had nothing to do with. It showed he had abused his powers as president, not only in orchestrating a cover-up of what had happened, but just across the board from his enemies list, his use of the Internal Revenue Service to go after people, the line that had just become one lie too many for his supporters until the point they, on a bipartisan basis, abandoned him.
All right, John Gartner, I want to talk here about the tendency to tweet and the indiscipline that comes from that. The Obama wiretapping charge, for instance, it seemed to me right away that the FISA requirement would mean there'd have to be criminal intent. So he's tweeting about potentially self-incriminating himself. What do you think about this whole tweeting indiscipline thing? What does it mean?
I think there's a manic component to this. It's very bipolar. He's up all night. He's getting agitated. He's irritable. He's aggressive. He feels attacked. And at 3 a.m, when he should be sleeping, he's spewing out crazy stuff. So I think he's getting manic in the middle of the night and reacting to things he's seeing on TV and then impulsively spewing out crazy ideas that he reads on conspiracy websites that come from his own head. But it really is an example of why he, they talk about what is the president going to do when he gets the 3 a.m. phone call, meaning what's going to happen if there's a crisis in the middle of the night. He is the 3 a.m. phone call. He is the crisis. Instead of being the person who's going to be able to deal with chaos in the world, he creates chaos in the world.
How come he
very,
can't?
Very dangerous.
Why can't he control the indisciplined part of that? I mean, John Dean will certainly say that Nixon was up in the middle of the night too, but he was able to control not walking out the front door of the White House and screaming what was bothering him. Why does this guy have to get it into a tweet right away?
Well, I think Mr. Dean's point is a very important one. It's been written about elsewhere in terms of this mental illness issue, that it's one thing to have some mental illness or some mental instability if it doesn't affect your public behavior and your public decisions and your public persona. And that's where Trump really takes it over the line, because he can't control himself. It'd be one thing if he was melting down in private, but able to behave appropriately in public. A lot of people with mental illnesses have some private distress but are able to function in their job. He is not. He announced on day one that he was his psychiatric disability made him incapable of functioning when he created the whole crisis around crowd size, which, like the tweet about the FBI, actually doesn't do him any good. This crazy like a fox theory is incorrect. He's not crazy like a fox. He's crazy like a crazy.
Okay.
Occam's razor says the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. The simplest explanation for why he keeps saying crazy stuff is he's crazy. This doesn't help him. Like you said, he's either guilty of Russian espionage and that's why there was a FISA warrant, or he's making this stuff up and he's paranoid and crazy. So either one of those makes him look bad. So it's not a strategy; it is a pathology.
All right, let's ask John Dean now. I'm going to go to managing the White House now. There's some people that will say that Trump really wants to be the brand manager of Make America Great, and he's put in a very strong staff, someone like a General Mattis, for instance, who's universally respected. So I want to ask you if you think that might work, coupled with, do you see the Reince Priebus, Steve Bannon, coalition as similar to Haldeman and Ehrlichman in some way?
I see him not putting in a strong staff at this point. What he's done, a president has about 4,000 appointees that are not all presidential Senate confirmed, but they're sub-cabinet and assistant secretaries and what have you. He is so far behind the curve on filling the jobs that the executive branch is really not working right now. I'll give you an anecdote that makes the point. An author friend of mine went to the State Department recently and gave a talk. He said the place was packed to the absolutely overwhelmed how full the auditorium was. And he finally asked a couple people, how come all you people are here? He said, we have nothing to do. And so we came to hear your book talk. He was very distressed about the fact he had that kind of turnout. So Trump has not established a real working presidency at this point. He's way behind. He does want to be the one who controls everything. They're obviously putting restraints on who can be appointed to these sub-cabinet posts, and as a result, it's not happening very quickly or very smoothly. And at some point, for example, Congress expects the administration to come up and state their position before committees on the Hill. Well, they're starting to have hearings, and the Trump administration is not sending anybody up to state the administration's position. It's just bizarre what's going on.
Fascinating, boy.
I think there's a method to that madness, though. I think there's a method to that madness, and it has to do with his fascistic drive for power. The two things now that hold him back are the press and the civil service. And he's trying to demonize the press and hollow out the civil service. As Rachel Maddow pointed out, he fired all of the top people at the State Department who have collectively like 150 years of knowledge about how to deal with Russia, among other things. They got rid of every one of the U.S. attorneys. Literally from day one, he fired every Obama appointee. And as Mr. Dean has been slow to replace them. In other words, what he's trying to do is hollow out any independent voice that could contradict him and civil servants are, in some ways, that independent voice, especially people like the State Department people he got rid of who had served 8 presidents. They have the collective wisdom of 8 presidencies worth of knowledge about foreign relations. You get rid of those people, and who do you have? You just have wackos like Steve Bannon running the show.
And you're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell from our flagship stations, Yale Radio, WYBC, and WGCH, Greenwich. Final segment, we'll close out with some Trump presidency predictions. Watergate legend John Dean, leadership psychologist John Gartner on board. I want to start off, get both your opinions quickly. Can a bad guy be a good president?
I'm sure a lot of bad guys have been good presidents. I flashed immediately when you said that on my digging into the social science on authoritarianism. And some of these guys are, these personalities make great corporate heads. They're good in law enforcement. They rise to the top of the military. And I'm sure some of our presidents have been authoritarian personalities and pretty rough people to live with in any other realm. So I suspect that the answer is yes. Nixon, one of his strengths were some of his hard-held views that were deeply associated with his own psychology, his China initiative, his détente with Russia. He didn't care much about domestic policy and let his aides create things like the Environmental Protection Agency. And they actually played with health care because he said, just don't get me arrested, and let his staff do pretty much what they wanted. And it was a fairly moderate staff at that point.
Very, very interesting. John Gartner, let me ask you this. Trump is so focused on winning, it's almost a psychological need. Is that going to help him survive in your mind?
No, because, again, with Trump, it's more than just his being an authoritarian personality, which is bad enough. But as Mr. Dean pointed out, some authoritarian personalities in the right situation can be effective. He also is detached from reality, and that is the real key difference. That's why we know that this has got to end in tragedy, because someone who is psychotic cannot lead.
Maybe you could explain this. He seems to only be able to function in chaos, which, of course, must be stress for the staff. Mm-hmm. Why does he thrive on it? Why does he need to have chaos instead of some stability in there?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I think you really did put your finger on something. He thrives on chaos. He creates chaos. The very opposite of what we need a president to do. I mean, America has been the cornerstone of stability since World War II. And now we are being led by someone who is not only unstable, but at some level willfully or almost maliciously seems to take a certain perverse pleasure in creating a crisis that he himself is generating. That actually goes with the malignant narcissistic personality disorder. There's a perverse kind of pleasure they get in creating chaos and crises.
All right, John Dean, Nixon always prided himself on pressure in crisis. And Leon Pernetta has said, don't know whether this White House is capable of responding in a thoughtful or careful way should a crisis erupt. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think there's an element of truth in that. Nixon did become somewhat detached and analytical in a crisis situation. There were crises he tried to provoke during Watergate in the late days to try to shift attention away from his own problems. And he's pretty cool and calculating about it. You listen to him on the tapes, and he is pretty analytical and good. What Nixon is terrible at is small talk, and he is not a naturally articulate speaker. You get that behind closed doors, and you realize how articulate he was in public. It's because he rehearsed himself so much before he gave public addresses. So he's pretty disciplined with whatever problems baggage he might have been carrying.
All right, let me ask John Dean. We're going to get into predictions now. You talked about that it took 900 days for Nixon to come down, and that Trump seems to be on a fast track. What I want to ask is your thoughts on is impeachment a possibility realistically? And secondly, you know a lot about the intel community and the relationships there and what it meant in Watergate. Do you think Trump is crazy to be taking on the intel community?
I think he's asking for trouble because he needs them and their goodwill. If we have a national security crisis, he's got to be able to rely on him. They're not even, apparently, as we have heard, giving him all the intelligence because they don't trust him for fear he'll reveal something that they know that should not be revealed.
John Gartner now, and John Dean brought this up off air, and it's interesting, do you think there is a way to manage Trump, to deal with Trump amongst his staff or whoever it would go, whether it's the vice president? And is there someone there that could let him know there's a cancer on the presidency, as John Dean did with President Nixon?
Here's what's really terrifying. This is a worst-case scenario from several points of view. First of all, this is someone who is unmanageably crazy. Nobody can control Donald Trump. Kellyanne Conway's got bags under her eyes like 2 feet deep, just trying to keep him, ambulatory for an hour at a time. But it doesn't last very long. He can use his indoor voice for the address to Congress, but that's about as long as he can maintain it. But now to make things worse, we said you say the cover-up was worse than the crime. Well, if Trump actually colluded with the Russians to steal the election, I think the crime was worse than the cover-up. But the cover-up is called the Republican Party. But this, unlike the honest Republicans of John Dean's era, who came to him in a bipartisan way to ask him to leave, our current Republican Party, I'm sorry to say, is so corrupt and amoral that they are enabling this lunatic, and they're going to enable him until we go over the cliff.
Which leads me to ask you, there is another option versus impeachment, which is invoking the 25th Amendment, which could come from his own people. Do you think that is a possibility in any way?
Well, we've circulated a petition. We have 30,000 mental health professionals who have signed a petition saying he should be removed under the 25th Amendment. Yesterday, I was in Representative Blumenauer's office speaking to his chief legislative aide. They've been very active in trying to get mental health considerations included in the way in which the 25th Amendment is carried out. So we are working actively on that approach, though I have to admit I'm not that hopeful.
Okay, we're in the last minute. We'll give John Dean the last word. You've obviously sat face-to-face with a guy that was fighting for survival every day. Does what you know about Trump give you a feeling that he might be more successful at being a street fighter survivor than Nixon was?
Well, I think he's safe as long as he's got the Republicans in control of the two houses of Congress. After that, I don't think he has any safety at all. Or if he causes them problems, they're going to abandon him. Nixon, had he had a Republican Congress, never would have been impeached, or the effort never would have happened. He would have survived, however you want to play that out in history. So Trump is safe right now because, as John Gartner said, he's being protected, and this is all being covered up by the Republicans.
A fascinating and fast hour. Thanks to John Dean and John Gartner, I might say a sobering hour. Their books, again, John Gartner, In Search of Bill Clinton, A Psychological Bio, and John Dean, The Nixon Defense, What He Knew and When He Knew It, amongst other books. This has been Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Our next show, we will have a rebuttal show. In fairness, we'll have a leading conservative pundit. He'll talk about what he calls Trump's big agenda. Thanks to John Gartner. Thanks to John Dean. Thanks to our national audience for listening. And we'll see everybody next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell.